One of the things that the author of the book of the prophet Daniel wanted to address were the cultural conflicts between the Hellenistic society of the Seleucid Empire, which clashed with the Jewish society. One of the ways in which it clashed was obviously the desire of the king Antiochus IV to enculturate the Jewish people into Hellenistic society, to make them better Greeks, in effect, to Hellenize the Jews. Another conflict was between the Greek value of knowledge that comes from philosophy and the Jewish value of wisdom that comes from God. And in setting his stories in the Babylonian captivity, the author addresses these issues. He sets them in the captivity of Babylon, but is in fact addressing issues relevant to his time and the conflict with the Seleucid Empire in the mid-2nd century BC. And in the very first chapter of the book of Daniel, he tells the story of the food test, in which Daniel, along with his 3 companions, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, are brought into the court of Nebuchadnezzar to be enculturated and educated into Babylonian society. And among the first things that happens is their names are changed. Daniel is named Belteshazzar. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are named Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and we will hear more of these 3 in the story of the fiery furnace. In feeding these 4 men, Daniel objects, not wanting to defile themselves with the food offered to them by the king, which Jewish values consider unclean. So he says, feed us only vegetables. And of course the steward is concerned. If these young men look thinner than the other boys brought in for their education, he will be called to task by the king. And Daniel assures him, no, God will protect us. And in fact he did. These 4 young men looked healthier than the other men brought in for their education in Babylonian society. And at the end of this story, it says that God gave these 4 men knowledge and proficiency in all literature and wisdom, the 2 values of Greek and Jewish custom and culture. And to Daniel, the understanding of all visions and dreams. So a prophetic value, a prophetic charism that he gives to Daniel. And in this very simple story, which is the shortest one in the book of Daniel, we see the author addressing the conflicts between Hellenistic society and Jewish society set in a story in the Babylonian exile, in which it is from God that all knowledge and proficiency in literature and wisdom comes, and that these 4 young men were given that proficiency and knowledge because of their fidelity to Jewish culture and values. So how can we relate the story of Daniel's rejection of the Babylonian food to modern concerns? Well, when we look at the concerns of the author of Daniel, he wrote the book of the prophet Daniel at a time in which the Jewish people were undergoing a forced enculturation into the Hellenistic culture by the reign of King Antiochus IV. We see this expressed in such stories in the books of Maccabees as the story of the widow whose 7 sons were executed along with her because they would not eat pork, a food that was forbidden to them by their Jewish faith. They gave their lives in fidelity to those standards that they held as people who shared a covenant with God. In the story of Daniel, the author expresses that conflict because Daniel, along with his 3 companions, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, who are named Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, their Babylonian names, are undergoing enculturation and education in Babylonian culture, overseen by King Nebuchadnezzar. But they remain faithful to the standards of their faith by refusing to eat the food that was offered to them. Now the steward was afraid for his own life because the young men were refusing. But Daniel assured them of his safety, and God rewarded these men for their fidelity by seeing to it that they were healthier than the other young men brought in for Babylonian enculturation. In the same way, all throughout the church's history, followers of Christ, members of the church, have found themselves in societies that sometimes have values and standards that are not conducive to the Christian faith and sometimes contrary to the values of Christianity. We certainly see that in our modern world today, in which secularization has become very prominent in Western society. We see varying value systems that are contrary to the church on matters of, say, human sexuality and love, procreation, marriage, and the family, just to name a few. We have even seen some people who profess a Catholic and a Christian faith forsaking that faith and allowing themselves to be enculturated into modern secular standards. But we see in the story of Daniel how God calls us to be faithful to the faith that we profess, even in the small ways in which we observe that faith in how we live our lives, the morals we express, the food that we eat, the practices of worship that we are called to live as a community of faith, not to allow ourselves to be enculturated into a secular society that is at times contrary to the Christian faith, but that in some ways we stand out because of our fidelity to the values given to us by Christ as we live our lives as his followers.